You don't have to sit alone, the little girl said gently. Daniel Carter didn't look up. I do, he said quietly, his voice tired and rough. I want to sit alone. So don't worry about me, okay? You shouldn't be talking to strangers anyway. He expected her to leave. Instead, the small voice came a little closer. There's still space on the bench. Could I sit here for a little bit? I'm waiting for my mom, and she told me to stay where she can see me. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, then shifted slightly to the side. Fine, he said. You can sit, but I'm not very good company. That's okay, she said as she climbed onto the bench beside him. I can be good company for both of us. For a moment, they sat in silence. Snow fell softly. People walked past carrying wrapped gifts and cups of hot chocolate. A group near the fountain began singing Christmas carols, slightly off-key but happy. The little girl noticed the papers in Daniel's hands. She leaned a little closer, careful, polite, not touching, just looking. She could see the hospital logo at the top, lines of words she didn't understand, and a diagram of a heart. Are you waiting for someone? She asked gently. Daniel stared at the papers for a long moment before answering. I was. The girl tilted her head. Were? The person I was waiting for, he said slowly. Decided she didn't want to wait with me anymore, so she left. The girl looked at the papers again. Is it because you're sick? Daniel gave a small, tired smile. You're very observant. It says heart right there, she said, pointing with her mitten. And you look like my mama did when the doctor told her she was sick. Daniel turned and looked at her more carefully now. Your mom is sick? She nodded. Yeah, but she still works, and she still makes Christmas. Daniel looked down at the papers again, then folded them slowly and held them in his lap. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then the little girl said softly, You know, you don't have to sit here by yourself. I can sit with you, and if you want, you can tell me what happened. My mama says talking makes the heavy stuff a little lighter. Daniel let out a long breath through his nose. He didn't know why, but it suddenly felt very hard to keep everything inside. I got these this morning, he said, tapping the papers lightly. Test results. The doctor says, my heart is very sick. The girl listened without interrupting, and when my girlfriend heard, he continued, his voice tightening slightly, she decided she didn't want to be with a man who might spend a lot of time in hospitals. She said she didn't sign up for that. Then she picked up her bag and walked out. The words sounded flat in the cold air, like something that had already happened to someone else. So, Daniel said quietly, looking out at the lights. I didn't feel like going home tonight. I didn't feel like going to a party or pretending to be okay. So I came here. I guess I just ended up spending Christmas Eve on a bench. The little girl was very quiet for a moment. Then she said, That's a very bad day. Daniel gave a short laugh. Yeah, it really is. She swung her legs gently and looked straight ahead, just like he was doing. Then she turned to him and spoke very gently. You're sick, she said, and you think people will leave because of that. But my mama was sick before too, so I understand a little. When someone you love is sick, it's scary, but it also means they need people more, not less. Daniel looked at her, surprised by the calm way she said it. So, she continued, if you come to our house tonight, it will be you and me and my mama, 3 people. We'll sit at the table together, and you won't have to sit on this bench by yourself thinking about sad things. He shook his head slowly. No, I don't think that's a good idea. The girl frowned a little. Why not? Because, he said quietly, I'm a sick man, and when people find out you're sick, they leave. It's easier that way. I don't want to show up at your house and then disappear one day. You're just a kid. You don't need that. The little girl listened very carefully. Then she held out her mittened hand. My name is Annie, she said. I forgot to tell you before. He looked at her small hand, then shook it gently. Daniel. Okay, Daniel, Annie said. Now we're not strangers anymore. She scooted a little closer on the bench. My mama says when someone is sick, that's when you sit closer, not farther away, she said. So if you're sick, then you should sit with us on Christmas. 3 people can share the sad and make it smaller. And you won't have to be alone. Daniel felt his throat tighten again. You said the person you were waiting for left, Annie continued softly. But we're not leaving. We're right here. And if you come eat with us, then tonight you'll have a family table instead of a cold bench. Across the street, the grocery store door opened, and a woman stepped out carrying 2 heavy bags. She looked around quickly, searching the park, then spotted Annie and started walking toward them. Annie waved. "That's my mama," she said, then looked back at Daniel. "Come meet her. And if you still want to sit alone after that, you can, but you don't have to." Sarah Williams noticed the man before she reached the bench. "Annie," Sarah called gently as she walked toward them, grocery bags heavy in her hands. "Honey, I told you to stay where I could see you." "I did, Mama," Annie said quickly, running to take one of the bags from her. "I was right here, and I made a friend." Sarah's eyes moved to Daniel. He stood straight, polite, like a man who had been raised to respect mothers. "I'm sorry if I worried you," he said. "She just came and sat with me. I hope that was all right." Before Sarah could answer, Annie spoke quickly, like she was afraid the moment might disappear if she didn't explain everything. "Mama, this is Daniel. He had a very bad day. The doctor said his heart is sick, and the lady he loves left him, so he was going to sit alone on Christmas. But I told him he didn't have to." Sarah blinked, surprised by the honesty of that introduction, but Daniel gave a small, embarrassed smile. "She's not wrong," he said quietly. Sarah looked at him more carefully now, really seeing him. The pale face, the tired eyes, the envelope in his hand that looked like hospital paperwork. She softened immediately, the way women do when they recognize real pain. "Well," she said gently, "Christmas Eve is a hard night to spend alone." "Yes, ma'am," Daniel said quietly. "It is." Annie tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mama, I told him he can come have Christmas with us," she said. "So he won't be alone." Sarah looked at Daniel, and for a moment he thought she might say no, that she would take Annie's hand and walk away, and this strange, fragile moment would end right here on the sidewalk. But Sarah just said, "We don't have much, just a small dinner, but no one should be alone on Christmas." Daniel opened his mouth to politely refuse again, and that was when he saw her. Across the street, walking under the Christmas lights, was Vanessa. She was wearing the white coat he had bought her last winter, her hand wrapped around the arm of a tall man in a gray scarf. They were laughing about something, walking close together, like people who had plans later. Vanessa looked up. She saw Daniel. For a split second, she froze. Then her expression changed into something between annoyance and amusement, like she had just run into an inconvenient memory. "Well," she said as she and the man walked up to the sidewalk where Daniel, Annie, and Sarah stood. "I didn't expect to see you here." Daniel looked at her hand on the other man's arm, then back at her face. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I didn't expect to see you either. Not so soon." Vanessa shrugged slightly. "Life moves on," she said. "You should try it." Daniel let out a small, humorless breath. "This morning," he said, "you told me you couldn't be with a man who might spend time in hospitals, and tonight you're already out celebrating. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next story. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter." She smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "Daniel, you're rich, not naive. The world doesn't stop because you get sick. I told you the truth. Most people would have just slowly disappeared." The man beside her looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Vanessa glanced at Annie and Sarah briefly, then back at Daniel. "You'll be fine," she said lightly. "Men like you always are. Just hire the best doctors money can buy." Then she turned, looped her arm more tightly through the other man's arm, and said over her shoulder, "Merry Christmas, Daniel." And just like that, she walked away. For a moment, no one spoke. Annie didn't understand what had just happened, but she could feel the sadness again, heavy and quiet beside her. She slipped her small hand into Daniel's hand without saying anything. Sarah said softly, "I'm sorry. That must have been very hard." Daniel watched until Vanessa disappeared into the crowd. Then he looked down at Annie's small hand holding his. "You know," he said slowly, his voice quieter but steadier than before, I think I changed my mind. Annie looked up. About what? About sitting alone tonight, he said. Her face lit up immediately. So you'll come have Christmas with us? Daniel nodded once. Yeah, he said. If your mom is really sure. Sarah gave him a gentle smile. I'm sure. Annie grinned and grabbed his hand with both of hers now. See? I told you. You don't have to sit alone. They started walking toward the apartment. Daniel had eaten in some of the most expensive dining rooms in the world. He had sat under crystal chandeliers in New York, across polished tables in Paris, in private rooms where waiters spoke in quiet voices and poured wine that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He had discussed million-dollar deals over plates that looked more like art than food. But none of those meals stayed in his memory the way this one did. The apartment was warm, the windows slightly fogged from the heat of the oven. The small Christmas tree in the corner leaned exactly the way Annie had promised, as if it had tried its best and then just decided that was good enough. Paper ornaments hung beside old glass ones, and a string of popcorn wrapped around the branches in uneven loops. It leans more every year, Annie said proudly as Daniel looked at it. Mama says it has personality. I think it has perseverance, Daniel said. It refuses to fall even when life pushes it. Sarah smiled a little at that as she set the plates on the table. That tree and I have something in common, she said. They sat down together, the three of them around the small table. Annie insisted Daniel sit in the chair closest to the tree. So you can be in the Christmas corner, she explained. The food was simple, but it smelled wonderful. Roast chicken, macaroni and cheese, and sweet potatoes with melted marshmallows on top, just like Annie had promised. Daniel looked at the plate for a moment before picking up his fork. I can't remember the last time I had dinner at a table like this, he said. Sarah sat across from him. What kind of table do you usually eat at? He thought about it. Long conference tables, kitchen counters, airplane trays, alone, most of the time, a quiet one, he said finally. Annie frowned slightly. Quiet is okay, she said. But not on Christmas. They began to eat, and for a few minutes Annie did most of the talking. She told Daniel about her school, about how she liked reading but not math, about how her mom worked a lot but still came to every school play even if she was tired. Daniel listened to every word like it mattered, because to Annie, it did. Halfway through dinner, Sarah looked at him and said gently, You don't have to tell us anything you don't want to, but sometimes it helps to say things out loud. Daniel set his fork down for a moment. He wasn't used to talking about himself unless it was business. Numbers, plans, strategies, those things were easy. Feelings were not. This morning, he said slowly, I went to the hospital for some tests. I thought it was just stress. I work too much. Don't sleep enough. I figured the doctor would tell me to take a vacation. Sarah listened quietly, but instead, he continued. He told me my heart is weak, that I might need surgery, that if I don't take it seriously, I might not have as much time as I thought. Annie had stopped eating now, watching him carefully, and when I told Vanessa, he said, staring at the table, she looked at me like I had just ruined her future. She said she didn't want to spend her life in hospitals and waiting rooms. Then she left. The room was very quiet now except for the soft hum of the heater. I think, Daniel said after a moment, that was the moment I realized something. I have a very big house. I have a very big company. I have a lot of money, but I don't actually have anyone who would sit in a hospital waiting room for me. Annie slid her small hand across the table and placed it on top of his. I would, she said simply. Daniel looked at her, his eyes suddenly burning again. I'm serious, Annie continued. I'm very good at waiting. I wait for Mama all the time when she works late. Sarah reached over and squeezed Annie's shoulder gently, then looked at Daniel. You don't know us, she said, but I know what it feels like to sit in a doctor's office and hear bad news. And I know what it feels like to be afraid and still go home and cook dinner and keep going because someone is counting on you. Daniel nodded slowly. You understand more than most people I know. Sarah gave a small, sad smile. Life teaches some people earlier than others. They finished dinner, and Annie insisted Daniel help her put a star on top of the leaning tree. He had to stand on a small step stool while Annie held the tree steady and Sarah laughed softly from the couch. Perfect, Annie said when the star was finally straight. Now it's a proper Christmas. Later, They sat in the living room with mugs of hot chocolate. Annie sat on the floor with crayons, drawing very seriously on a piece of paper. Daniel looked around the apartment again. It was small, a little worn, but everywhere he looked there were signs that someone cared. Clean dishes drying on a towel, a stack of library books, a photo of Annie and Sarah taped to the wall. "You built a good life here," he said quietly to Sarah. She followed his gaze around the room. "I built a safe life," she said. "That was the goal." "That's harder," he said. Annie suddenly stood up and walked over, holding her drawing. "I made something," she announced. She handed the paper to Daniel. It was a drawing of a small house with a crooked Christmas tree beside it. 3 stick figures stood in front of the house holding hands. One was tall, one medium, one small. Above them was a big yellow star. "That's you," Annie said, pointing to the tall stick figure. "And that's Mama. And that's me." Daniel stared at the drawing for a long moment. "You drew me very tall," he said quietly. "You are tall," Annie said, "and you look less sad when you're standing next to us." He swallowed and nodded, unable to speak for a second. "Can I tell you something, Daniel?" Annie asked. "Of course." She climbed up onto the couch beside him. "When I saw you on the bench," she said, "you looked like you were lost. Not like you didn't know where the park was, but like you didn't know where your people were." Daniel felt that sentence land somewhere deep inside him. "And now?" he asked softly. Annie leaned her head lightly against his arm. "Now you found us," she said. "So you're not lost tonight." Daniel looked at Sarah, and she held his gaze for a moment. There was no pressure in her eyes, no expectation, just a quiet understanding, and a kind of strength he hadn't seen in a long time. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the city in white. Inside the small apartment, the leaning tree glowed softly, and a 6-year-old girl sat beside a man with a broken heart and acted like it was the most normal thing in the world. For the first time in months, Daniel did not think about the test results in his coat pocket. For the first time in a very long time, he thought about something else instead. He thought about what it might feel like to belong somewhere. Daniel did not leave right after dinner. At first, he told himself he would stay just long enough to be polite. Long enough to finish the hot chocolate Annie insisted on making extra sweet because it's Christmas. Long enough to thank Sarah properly for the meal. Long enough to step back out into the cold and return to his large, silent house where nothing waited for him except expensive furniture and unopened mail. But time moved differently in that small apartment. Annie sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully coloring the drawing she had made earlier. Every now and then she would look up to make sure Daniel was still there, like she didn't quite trust that he wouldn't disappear if she looked away too long. Sarah stood at the sink washing dishes, her movements slow and steady. Daniel stood up automatically after a few minutes and walked over. "Let me help," he said. She shook her head. "You're a guest." "I haven't been a guest in someone's home in a very long time," he replied. "I'd like to earn my dinner." She handed him a towel. "All right," she said. "You can dry." They worked side by side in comfortable silence for a few minutes. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel empty, the kind that felt like two people sharing the same space without needing to fill every second with words. "You don't talk like most people I know," Sarah said after a while. Daniel glanced at her. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" "It means you're not trying to impress anyone," she said. "Most people who have money make sure you know it within 5 minutes." He gave a small smile. "Most people who know I have money treat me differently within 5 minutes, so sometimes it's easier not to mention it." She studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly like that answer made sense. When the dishes were done, Annie ran over and grabbed Daniel's hand. "Come see the tree when the lights are off," she said. "It looks better in the dark." She turned off the lamp, and the room fell into a soft glow from the Christmas lights alone. The little tree leaned in the corner, glowing gold and red and green, reflecting in the window like there were 2 trees instead of 1. "It's beautiful," Daniel said quietly. Annie leaned against his side. "Mama says Christmas isn't about how big the tree is," she said. "It's about who is sitting near it." Daniel felt that sentence settle somewhere deep in his chest. After a while, Annie started to yawn, her head dropping against his arm. "Okay, little one," Sarah said gently. "Time for bed." "I'm not tired," Annie mumbled, already half asleep. "You say that every night," Sarah said with a smile. Annie stood up. then suddenly turned and hugged Daniel around the waist without warning. He froze for a second, surprised, then slowly put his arms around her small shoulders. "I'm glad you didn't sit alone," she said sleepily. "Merry Christmas, Daniel." "Merry Christmas, Annie," he said softly. Sarah led Annie down the short hallway, and Daniel heard quiet voices, the sound of a blanket being pulled up, and Annie asking if Daniel would still be there in the morning. "I'm sure he has his own home to go to," Sarah said gently. Daniel looked around the small living room while they were gone. The couch had a blanket folded neatly over one side. There were children's books stacked on a small shelf. On the wall were a few photos, Annie at different ages, always smiling, always with her mother. Sarah came back a minute later and sat down across from him. "She'll sleep like a rock now," she said. "Christmas always wears her out." Daniel nodded, not sure why he suddenly felt nervous sitting there alone with Sarah in the quiet apartment. "Thank you," he said after a moment, "for tonight. You have no idea what this meant to me." Sarah leaned back slightly in her chair. "I think I do," she said. "I've had nights like that too." He looked at her. "When you said earlier that you understood doctors' offices, you meant it, didn't you?" She nodded slowly. "A few years ago," she said, "I got very sick. I couldn't work for a while. Bills piled up. Annie was still very little, and her father decided that wasn't the life he wanted." Daniel didn't interrupt. "I remember sitting at our kitchen table after Annie went to sleep," Sarah continued, her voice calm but distant, like she was looking at an old memory. "I had a stack of medical bills in front of me and $23 in my bank account, and I thought, this is how people disappear, not all at once, just piece by piece until there's nothing left." Daniel felt his hands tighten slightly. "But we didn't disappear," she said. "I got better. I went back to work. I learned how strong I actually was because I didn't have a choice." She looked at him then, directly. "So when Annie says you don't have to sit alone, she means it. Because we know what that bench feels like. Maybe not the exact same bench, but one like it." Daniel sat very still for a long moment. "I have a house," he said slowly. "It's too big for one person. When I walk in, the lights turn on automatically. The temperature is always perfect. Everything is quiet. Too quiet. Tonight is the first night in a long time that I heard someone laugh in the same room I was in." Sarah didn't say anything, but her eyes softened. "The doctor told me this morning that I need surgery," Daniel continued. "Soon. There are risks, big ones. And the only thing I could think was, if something goes wrong, there won't be anyone sitting there. No one in the waiting room. No one to drive me home. Nothing." The words hung in the air between them. Sarah folded her hands together on the table. "If you have that surgery," she said quietly, "you won't be alone." Daniel looked up at her. She held his gaze calmly. "No one should go through something like that alone," she said. "Not if they don't have to." He didn't trust himself to speak for a moment, so he just nodded. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the streets and sidewalks and park benches, covering the place where a few hours ago he had been sitting with a stack of papers in his hands, thinking his life had just ended. Now he was sitting in a small apartment with a leaning Christmas tree and a woman who spoke quietly and a little girl sleeping down the hall who had decided, for reasons he still didn't understand, that he was worth saving a seat for. And for the first time since that morning in the hospital, Daniel felt something unfamiliar but fragile begin to grow inside him. Not certainty, not happiness, but something that felt a little like hope. Daniel did not plan to fall asleep on their couch, but sometime after midnight, while he and Sarah were still talking in low voices so they wouldn't wake Annie, the exhaustion of the day finally caught up with him. One moment he was sitting there, listening to the quiet hum of the heater and the occasional car passing outside, and the next he woke up to the smell of something warm and sweet. For a second, he didn't know where he was. The ceiling above him was unfamiliar. The couch beneath him was too short for his height, and a knitted blanket had been placed over him sometime during the night. He sat up slowly, his heart giving that now familiar tight squeeze in his chest, and heard Annie's voice from the kitchen. "He's still sleeping," she whispered, not very quietly. "Do you think he's okay, Mama?" "I think he's just tired," Sarah replied softly. "Yesterday was probably a very long day for him, Daniel stood and walked toward the kitchen. Annie turned immediately when she saw him. "You're awake," she said, as if this was very good news. "I am," he said, his voice still thick with sleep. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to fall asleep on your couch." "You didn't fall asleep," Annie said seriously. "You passed out from Christmas." Daniel laughed quietly. "That sounds like a real medical condition." Sarah handed him a mug of coffee. "Sit," she said. "Breakfast is almost ready." He sat at the small table again, and Annie climbed into the chair across from him like this was already a routine they had done 100 times. "What are we having?" he asked. "Pancakes," Annie said proudly. "Christmas pancakes. They're shaped like snowmen, but sometimes they look like blobs." "They look perfect," Daniel said, even though the one she showed him looked more like a lopsided cloud than a snowman. They ate together, and Daniel realized something strange. The tight feeling in his chest was still there. The diagnosis was still real. The future was still uncertain, but the fear was quieter this morning. Like someone had turned down the volume. After breakfast, Annie disappeared into her room and came back with a small box wrapped in red paper that had clearly been folded and taped by a child. "This is for you," she said, holding it out to him. Daniel blinked in surprise. "Annie, you didn't have to get me anything." "I didn't buy it," she said. "I made it." He carefully opened the paper. Inside was a small photo frame made out of popsicle sticks, painted blue and covered in tiny glitter stars. Inside the frame was the drawing she had made the night before, the 3 stick figures holding hands in front of the crooked tree. "I made it last week in school," Annie said. "But I didn't know who the tall person was going to be yet. Now I know." Daniel ran his thumb lightly over the glitter stars. He had received watches worth tens of thousands of dollars, rare bottles of wine, expensive artwork. None of them had ever made his hands shake like this. "Thank you," he said quietly. "This is the best gift I've ever received." Annie smiled like she had known that would be true. A little later, Daniel stood near the door, putting on his coat. The time had come for him to go back to his other life, the big house, the company, the doctors, the decisions he didn't want to make. "Do you have to go?" Annie asked, her voice small but trying to be brave. "I do," he said gently. "But I'll come back and visit, if that's okay with your mom." Sarah, who was standing near the kitchen, nodded. "You're welcome here, Daniel. But only if you come as a friend, not as a man who feels like he owes us something." He understood what she meant. Pride, dignity. Lines that shouldn't be crossed. "I'd like to come back as a friend." Annie walked up and hugged him again, quick and tight. "Friends sit together," she said. "Remember?" "I remember," he said softly. When Daniel stepped outside, the cold air hit his face, and he paused on the sidewalk. For a moment, he just stood there looking up at the gray winter sky. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "James," he said when the call connected, "cancel my meetings this week." There was a pause on the other end. "Sir, you have the board review, the investor call, and—" "Cancel them," Daniel repeated. "And schedule a meeting with the cardiac surgeon. The best one. I want to talk about the surgery as soon as possible." Another pause. "Yes, sir," James said, "right away." Daniel ended the call and stood there for a moment longer. For the first time since the diagnosis, he was not making this decision because he was afraid of dying. He was making it because, for the first time in a long time, he had a reason to try to live. He got into his car and drove home. The house greeted him the way it always did, lights turning on automatically, the temperature perfect, everything silent and in its place. But this time, when he walked into the kitchen and set Annie's glitter-covered photo frame on the counter, the house didn't feel quite as empty. He looked at the drawing again. 3 stick figures holding hands in front of a crooked Christmas tree. "You look less sad when you're standing next to us," Annie had told him. Daniel touched the edge of the frame lightly. Then he looked around the big, quiet house and said out loud, to no one and to himself at the same time, "I think I'd like to look less sad." That afternoon, he sat in the surgeon's office and listened carefully as the man explained the procedure, the risks, the recovery, the chances. "When would you like to schedule the surgery?" the doctor asked. Daniel thought about a small apartment with a leaning Christmas tree, about a little girl who believed no one should sit alone, about a woman who had said no one should go through something like that without someone in the waiting room. "As soon as possible," Daniel said, Because now, whether he lived or died, there was someone who would notice if he didn't come back. And that changed everything. Daniel had always believed that hospitals were places where powerful people went to fix problems quickly. You hired the best doctors, you paid for the best rooms, you signed the forms, scheduled the procedure, and then you walked out a few days later and went back to work. That was how the world worked when you had money. Problems became inconveniences. Inconveniences became appointments. But sitting in the cardiology wing 3 days after Christmas, Daniel realized there was one thing money could not buy. It could not buy someone who was scared for you. The waiting area was quiet, filled with the low hum of machines and the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes on polished floors. Across from him, an elderly couple sat side by side, holding hands without speaking. On the other side of the room, a middle-aged woman argued quietly with a receptionist about insurance forms while her teenage son stared at the floor. Daniel sat alone, a folder of paperwork in his hands again. More papers. More words about his heart. Risks. Percentages. Recovery time. Possible complications. He barely heard the nurse when she called his name. "Mr. Carter?" He stood up. "Yes. Dr. Reynolds will see you now." The surgeon's office was bright and neat, diplomas covering one wall, a large screen showing a diagram of a human heart. Dr. Reynolds was in his 50s, calm, direct, the kind of man who had spent his life opening chests and holding people's hearts in his hands. "I'm glad you came in quickly," the doctor said, shaking Daniel's hand. "I've reviewed your tests. We should talk seriously about surgery." Daniel sat down. "How serious?" Dr. Reynolds didn't soften his words. "Your heart is enlarged, and the muscle is weak. Medication will help for a while, but it won't fix the underlying problem. Surgery gives you a chance at a much longer life. Without it," he paused slightly, "we would be managing time, not solving the problem." Daniel nodded slowly. He appreciated honesty. He had built his entire life on numbers and reality, not pretty lies. "And the surgery?" Daniel asked. "The risks?" "There are always risks with heart surgery," the doctor said. "But you're relatively young. If the surgery goes well and you follow recovery guidelines, you could live a very normal life." "Could, not would." Daniel looked at the diagram of the heart on the screen. "How long would I be in the hospital?" "About a week, assuming no complications. Then several weeks of recovery. A week in the hospital, weeks at home. Alone," he thought automatically. As if the doctor could read his mind, he said, "You'll need someone to drive you home. And it's best if someone stays with you the first few days after surgery." Daniel nodded again, but he didn't say anything. "Do you have family nearby?" the doctor asked. Daniel hesitated. He thought of his empty house, of Vanessa's voice telling him she didn't sign up for this, of the long dining table where no one ever sat across from him. Then, unexpectedly, he thought of a small apartment, a leaning Christmas tree, a little girl with glitter on her hands saying, "I would sit in the hospital with you." "I have someone," Daniel said finally. The doctor smiled slightly. "Good. That matters more than people think." After the appointment, Daniel walked out into the cold afternoon and sat in his car for a long time without starting the engine. The city moved around him, people carrying shopping bags, couples arguing lightly on the sidewalk, a man walking a dog that kept trying to pull him toward a food truck. Normal life. Ordinary life. The kind of life he suddenly realized he wanted more than anything. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. He stared at it for a long time, then finally scrolled to a number he had saved only a few days ago. Sarah. He hesitated before pressing call. He wasn't used to calling people just because he wanted to hear their voice. Usually, when he called someone, it was because something needed to be done. But this was different. He pressed the button. "Hello?" Sarah's voice came through, slightly out of breath like she had been moving around. "Hi," Daniel said. "It's Daniel." "Oh," she said, and he could hear the small smile in her voice. "Hi, is everything okay? I just left the surgeon's office," he said. "We're scheduling the surgery." There was a small pause. "That was fast. I don't think waiting makes it less real," he said. "No," she said quietly. "It doesn't." Another small silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. "Daniel," she said after a moment. "Yes?" "You won't be alone," she said simply. "I meant what I said." He closed his eyes for a second, leaning back in the driver's seat. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear that until she said it again. "Thank you," he said quietly. Right then, he heard a small voice in the background. "Is that Daniel? Is that Daniel? Let me talk to him." He heard the phone shift. Then Annie's voice came on, loud and excited. "Daniel, Mama said you went to the heart doctor. Did they fix you?" He laughed softly. "Not yet, but they're going to try." "Good," Annie said, "because I already drew another picture, and you're in this one too, so you can't go anywhere." He felt his throat tighten again, but this time he was smiling. "That sounds like a very important reason to stay alive." "It is," Annie said seriously. "Also, Mama says after surgery you have to eat healthy food. But I think sometimes you should still eat pancakes. Because pancakes make people happy." "I think that's excellent medical advice," Daniel said. "Okay," Annie said. "You tell the doctor that." "I will." When the phone went back to Sarah, she said quietly, "She's been asking about you every day." "I've been thinking about you both every day," he admitted. There was a small pause on the line, but it was a warm one. "Daniel," Sarah said, "whatever happens with the surgery, you're not on that bench anymore. Do you understand?" He looked out through the windshield at the winter sky. Pale and cold but bright. "Yes," he said softly. "I think I do." And for the first time since the doctor had said the word heart in that quiet office, Daniel realized he was no longer fighting just to avoid dying. He was fighting because somewhere in a small apartment with a leaning Christmas tree, two people had already made a place for him at the table, and he wanted to go back to that table. Daniel scheduled the surgery for the second week of January. He chose the date the way he made most important decisions in his life, quickly, directly, without giving himself too much time to think about fear. The surgeon's office called it being decisive. In truth, Daniel knew himself well enough to understand that if he waited too long, he might start imagining everything that could go wrong. In the days leading up to the surgery, his big house no longer felt like a place he belonged. He found himself spending less and less time there, and more time in the small apartment across town where the Christmas tree still stood in the corner, now slightly more crooked than before. He didn't arrive with gifts or expensive things. The first time he came back after Christmas, he brought a toolbox. The kitchen sink had been dripping. Sarah had mentioned it casually on Christmas night, and 2 days later Daniel stood under the sink in rolled-up sleeves, tightening a pipe while Annie lay on the floor beside him, holding a flashlight very seriously. "You're very good at this," Annie said. "I build companies," Daniel replied from under the sink. "Fixing a pipe is much easier than fixing a company." "Companies break?" she asked. "All the time," he said, "usually because people stop listening to each other." Sarah, standing at the stove, glanced over at him when he said that, like she understood he wasn't just talking about business. After that day, Daniel became a quiet part of their routine. He came over after Annie's school sometimes and helped her with reading. He discovered she loved stories about explorers and astronauts, people who went far away but always tried to come home again. On Saturdays, he and Annie went to the small park near the apartment, where she showed him which swings were the fast ones and which bench was their bench, even though it wasn't the same bench where they first met. Sometimes he and Sarah would sit at the small kitchen table after Annie went to sleep and talk about ordinary things: work, bills, school, the price of groceries, the way the world seemed harder than it used to be. One evening, about a week before the surgery, Sarah asked, "Are you scared?" Daniel thought about lying. He had spent most of his life pretending he wasn't afraid of anything. "Yes," he said finally, "I am." She nodded like that was the right answer. "Good," she said. He looked at her surprised. "Good? People who aren't scared sometimes don't fight hard enough," she said. "Fear means you know something matters." He thought about that for a long time. A few days later, Annie made him a card. On the front, she had written in large, uneven letters, "For your heart surgery." Inside, she had drawn another picture. This time it was a hospital with a big red heart above it. 3 stick figures stood outside holding hands. One of the stick figures was lying in a bed inside the hospital window. "That's you," Annie explained. "And that's me and Mama outside. We're waiting." Daniel looked at the drawing for a long time. "You drew us waiting," he said quietly. "Yeah," Annie said, "because you said you were scared no one would be there, so I wanted you to see that we will." He swallowed and nodded. "Thank you," he said. This is very important. The night before the surgery, Daniel couldn't sleep. He walked through his house, turning lights on and off, moving from room to room. The place was spotless, quiet, perfect, and completely empty. He stopped in the kitchen and looked at the glitter-covered photo frame Annie had given him. The 3 stick figures stood in front of the crooked Christmas tree, holding hands like they belonged to each other. He picked up his phone and, after a moment, drove across town. It was almost 10 when he knocked on Sarah's door. She opened it looking surprised, but not annoyed. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know it's late. I just didn't want to be in that house tonight." She stepped aside immediately. "Then you shouldn't be in that house tonight," she said. "Come in." Annie was already in her pajamas but ran out of her room when she heard his voice. "You came," she said. Like this was the best possible decision he could have made. "I did," he said. They sat in the living room together, and Annie insisted on explaining the entire plan for tomorrow. "We're going to the hospital with you," she said, "and we're going to sit in the waiting room, and Mama says surgery takes a long time, so I'm bringing my coloring books. And when you wake up, we'll be there. So, you don't have to be scared." Daniel looked at Sarah. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "It could be a very long day." She nodded. "We'll be there," she said. "We don't leave people we care about alone in hospitals." He noticed she didn't say, "if you pay us or if you need us." She said, "people we care about." That night, Daniel slept on their couch again, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because for the first time in his life, he understood the difference between having a house and having somewhere to stay. Early the next morning, while Annie was still asleep, Daniel and Sarah sat at the kitchen table with coffee. "If something goes wrong," he said quietly, "I need you to know something." She immediately shook her head. "Don't." "I have to," he said gently. "I've already changed my will. Annie's name is in it." Sarah stared at him. "Daniel, I'm not telling you this because I think money fixes anything," he said. "I'm telling you this because Annie sat next to me on a bench when I had nothing but bad news in my hands, and no one had ever done that before." Sarah's eyes filled slightly, but she blinked it away. "You're going to come out of that surgery," she said firmly. "And then you can tell Annie all of this yourself when she's older. Right now, what she needs is for you to come back." Daniel nodded slowly. From the hallway, Annie's sleepy voice called, "Are you guys talking about me without me?" They both laughed quietly, and in that small kitchen, with the early morning light coming through the window and the sound of Annie's footsteps coming closer, Daniel realized something that would have sounded impossible to him just a few weeks ago. He was no longer facing the surgery as a man who had everything. He was facing it as a man who finally had something to lose. The morning of the surgery arrived in a quiet, pale light that made everything feel more serious than usual. Daniel woke up before anyone else. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was. Then he saw the small living room, the leaning Christmas tree still standing in the corner even though the holiday had passed, and the knitted blanket folded neatly over the back of the couch. He sat up slowly, pressing a hand lightly against his chest. The doctor had explained everything, the procedure, the risks, the recovery. Daniel had signed documents worth hundreds of millions of dollars in his life, without reading half the pages. But he had read every single word of those hospital forms, not because of the money, because now there were names in his life that were not written on contracts, but somehow mattered more. He stood and walked quietly to the kitchen. Sarah was already there, pouring coffee into 2 mugs like she had known he would wake up early. "I didn't sleep much," he admitted. "Me neither," she said. They sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, the same place where they had eaten Christmas dinner, the same place where Annie did her homework every afternoon. "Once this is over," Sarah said softly, "everything will feel different. Before and after. Life always divides itself like that when something big happens." Daniel nodded. "Most of my life has been before and after moments," he said. "Before I started my company. After it succeeded. Before my father died. After the funeral. Before yesterday morning. After the doctor said the word heart, like it was a countdown." Sarah wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. "And now this will be another one," she said. "Before the surgery." After the surgery, a small pair of footsteps came down the hallway, and Annie appeared. Her hair messy, still wrapped in a blanket like a small burrito. "Is it surgery day?" she asked, her voice still sleepy. Daniel smiled gently. "Yeah, It is. She walked over and climbed into his lap like it was the most natural thing in the world, like she had known him her whole life instead of just a few weeks. Okay, she said seriously. Then we have a plan. A plan? He asked. Yes, Annie said. Step 1. We go to the hospital. Step 2. The doctors fix your heart. Step 3. You come back and eat pancakes again. Daniel laughed softly. That sounds like a very good plan. I know, Annie said. I made it myself. At the hospital, everything moved quickly. Nurses, forms, signatures, bracelets on his wrist, a room with a bed and machines that beeped softly in the background. When the nurse came to take him to pre-op, Annie hugged him very tightly. Remember, she whispered, we're going to be right here when you wake up. So you don't have to be scared. He held her for a moment longer than he expected to. Thank you, he said quietly, for sitting with me on the bench that night. She pulled back and looked at him. You're welcome, she said. But you're not allowed to sit on benches alone anymore. That's the rule. I'll remember that, he said. Sarah stood in front of him then. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. There were so many things you could say before someone went into heart surgery, and none of them felt big enough. You come back, she said finally, her voice steady but her eyes bright. That's all you need to do. Just come back. I'll try, he said softly. That's not what I said, she replied. I said come back. He nodded once. Okay, he said. I'll come back. They wheeled him down a long hallway under bright lights. The ceiling tiles passed above him one by one, and he had a strange thought that this was what life felt like sometimes, like being moved through something you couldn't control, hoping the people walking beside you knew where you were going. In the operating room, everything was white and silver and bright. Machines, masked faces, calm voices. We're going to take good care of you, Mr. Carter, someone said. He nodded slightly as they adjusted the mask, as the anesthesia began to pull him under. His last clear thought was not about his company, or his house, or his money. It was about a crooked Christmas tree. It was about a little girl who didn't want him to sit alone. It was about a woman who said she would be in the waiting room. And then everything went dark. When Daniel opened his eyes again, the world was blurry and slow and heavy. His chest hurt, his throat was dry, and everything felt like it was wrapped in fog. But he was alive. A nurse noticed his eyes open and smiled. Welcome back, Mr. Carter, she said gently. The surgery went well. He tried to speak, but his voice didn't work right. He swallowed and tried again. There was a little girl, he managed. And her mother. Are they? They're here, the nurse said softly. They've been here all day. He closed his eyes for a second, relief washing over him so strongly it almost hurt more than the surgery. Would you like me to tell them you're awake? She asked. He nodded slightly. A few minutes later, he heard small footsteps first. Daniel? Annie's voice said carefully, like she was afraid if she spoke too loud he might disappear. He opened his eyes again, and there she was, standing beside the hospital bed, her small hand reaching carefully for his. I told you, she said softly, her eyes shining but not crying. We were going to be right here. Daniel looked past her at Sarah, who stood a little farther back, her hands clasped together like she had been holding herself still for hours. You came back, she said quietly. He couldn't say much, but he squeezed Annie's hand gently. He had gone into that surgery afraid of dying. He woke up realizing he had survived for a reason, because somewhere along the way, between a cold bench and a small apartment with a leaning Christmas tree, a man who had everything had found the only thing he actually needed, someone who would sit in the waiting room. When Daniel woke up the second time, the room was quieter and brighter, and the pain in his chest had settled into a deep, steady ache instead of the sharp, frightening pressure he remembered from before. For a few seconds, he just lay there, listening to the slow, steady beeping of the heart monitor beside him. The sound was strange and comforting at the same time, proof that his heart, broken, weak, unreliable as it had been, was still working. He turned his head slightly and saw Annie asleep in the chair beside his bed, curled up under a hospital blanket that was far too big for her. Her head leaned against Sarah's arm, and Sarah herself was asleep too, her head resting back against the wall, her hand still wrapped loosely around Annie's shoulder even in sleep. They had stayed. The nurse noticed he was awake and walked in quietly. You should be very proud, she said softly. Not everyone has people who stay this long in waiting rooms. Daniel looked at Annie and Sarah again. They're not technically family, he said, his voice still rough. The nurse smiled gently. Sometimes the people who choose to stay are more family than the ones you're born with. She checked his IV and the monitor, then said, "The surgery went very well. The doctor will talk to you later today. But right now, your job is simple. Rest and let your heart heal." Rest. It sounded like such a small thing, but Daniel realized he had not truly rested in years. Even on vacations, he checked emails. Even at night, he thought about work. Even in silence, his mind was loud. But now, lying in that hospital bed with a long scar across his chest and two people sleeping in uncomfortable chairs, just so he wouldn't wake up alone, Daniel felt something inside him slow down for the first time in a very long time. A few minutes later, Annie stirred. She opened her eyes, looked confused for a second, then saw Daniel watching her. Her face lit up instantly. "You're awake," she said, a little too loudly. Sarah woke up immediately. "Annie, quiet. Honey," she whispered, then looked at Daniel and exhaled like she had been holding that breath for hours. "Hi," she said softly. "Hi," he answered. For a moment, none of them said anything. There are moments in life when words are too small, and this was one of them. Annie carefully stood up and walked to the side of his bed. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "A little," he admitted. "But not as much as before." She nodded seriously. "That's because they fixed the broken part." He smiled slightly. "I think they did." Sarah stepped closer. "The doctor came out after the surgery," she said. "He said it went as well as they hoped. He said you were strong." Daniel let out a slow breath. Strong. He had always thought strength meant working longer hours than everyone else, making harder decisions, never showing fear. Now he was starting to think strength might be something else. "Thank you for staying," he said quietly. Sarah shook her head a little. "We told you we would." "I know," he said, "but people say a lot of things. Not everyone does them." Annie reached up and very carefully placed something on the small table beside his bed. It was another drawing. "I made this in the waiting room," she said. "So when you wake up, you wouldn't be bored." He picked it up slowly. The drawing showed a hospital bed with a very tall stick figure lying in it. Next to the bed were two smaller stick figures holding hands. Above all of them was a big red heart, and above that, a very crooked star. "That's the heart they fixed," Annie explained, pointing. "And that's me and Mama. We're still here. And that star is the one from the Christmas tree. So you remember where you're going back to." Daniel looked at the drawing for a long time, his vision blurring slightly again. "I think," he said quietly, "this might be the best hospital room in the world." Annie smiled. "Because we're in it?" "Yeah," he said, "because you're in it." Later that afternoon, the doctor came in and explained the surgery in more detail. Words like successful, repair, recovery, and careful monitoring filled the room. Daniel listened carefully, asking practical questions about medication, physical therapy, how long before he could work again. But when the doctor left, Annie climbed back into the chair and said, "So now what happens?" "Now," Daniel said, "I heal. And then?" "And then," he said slowly, "I try to live differently than I did before." Annie seemed satisfied with that answer. She leaned her head against the side of the bed carefully, making sure not to touch any wires. That evening, when Annie and Sarah had to go home so Annie could sleep in a real bed before school, Annie stood beside him and looked very serious again. "You're not allowed to be sad when you're here alone," she said, "because it's not the same as the bench. Now you know we're coming back." "I know," he said, "and when you get out of the hospital," she continued, "you should come stay with us for a little bit, because the doctor said someone has to watch you." Sarah looked like she was about to tell Annie not to invite people to live with them, but Daniel spoke first. "I think," he said slowly, "that might be the best idea I've heard in a very long time." Sarah met his eyes, searching his face to make sure he wasn't saying it out of pity or gratitude or obligation. "You'd be welcome," she said finally. "But only if you understand something." "What's that?" he asked. "In this house," she said gently, "you're not a billionaire. You're just Daniel. And you still have to eat vegetables and listen when the doctor says you need to rest." He smiled, a real smile this time. That sounds fair. Annie nodded. And sometimes pancakes, she added. Sometimes pancakes, Daniel agreed. That night, after they left, the hospital room felt quiet again. But it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. Before, the quiet had felt like emptiness. Now it felt like waiting. And Daniel realized something as he lay there, listening to the steady beeping of his repaired heart. A few weeks ago, he had been a man sitting alone on a bench, holding a piece of paper that felt like the end of his life. Now he was a man in a hospital bed, holding a child's drawing that looked like the beginning of something. And for the first time in a very long time, Daniel Carter was not afraid of what came next. Daniel was discharged from the hospital 5 days later, with a paper bag full of medication, a list of instructions, and a stern warning from Dr. Reynolds. No lifting anything heavier than 10 pounds, no driving for a few weeks, plenty of rest, short walks, and someone needs to stay with you, the doctor said, looking at him over his glasses. Heart surgery is not something you recover from by pretending you're fine. Daniel gave a small smile. I'm starting to learn that pretending I'm fine is not a long-term strategy. Good, the doctor said. Then you're already making progress. Sarah handled most of the discharge paperwork while Daniel sat in a wheelchair, which he hated but was too tired to argue about. Annie walked beside him very seriously, holding the paper bag with his medication like it was a very important job. I'm in charge of the heart medicine, she explained. Mama is in charge of the food, and you are in charge of resting. That sounds like I have the easiest job, Daniel said. No, Annie said. Resting is actually very hard for grown-ups. Mama says you guys don't know how to do it. Sarah laughed quietly. She's not wrong. Instead of giving the driver his home address, Daniel gave him Sarah's. The car ride was quiet. Daniel watched the city pass by through the window, feeling strangely like he was seeing everything differently. People walking dogs, a man arguing into his phone, a woman carrying a toddler on her hip while holding a grocery bag in the other hand. Ordinary life. Messy and loud and imperfect. I used to think, Daniel said slowly from the back seat, that success meant building a life where nothing could touch you. No problems, no noise, no inconvenience. Sarah glanced at him slightly. And now? Now I think that kind of life is just another way of being alone, he said. Annie reached over from the middle seat and carefully patted his arm like she was comforting someone much younger than herself. It's okay, she said. You live with us now, so you're not alone. Daniel smiled and looked out the window again before she could see the emotion on his face. Back at the apartment, Sarah had clearly prepared. There were extra pillows on the couch, clean blankets, a small table moved closer so he could reach water and medicine easily. She had even taped a piece of paper to the wall that said in big letters, Daniel's Heart Rules. Underneath were written, 1. Take medicine. 2. Eat vegetables. 3. Walk a little. 4. No work. 5. No being sad alone. Daniel stared at the list. Number 5 seems very specific. Annie nodded proudly. That's the most important one. The first few days were harder than Daniel expected. He was tired all the time. His chest hurt when he moved too quickly. Sometimes just walking from the couch to the kitchen felt like he had run a mile. But every time he woke up, he heard sounds. Annie getting ready for school. Sarah in the kitchen. The TV in the evening. Dishes. Laughter. Life. He wasn't alone with the pain. And that made the pain easier to carry. One afternoon, about a week after he left the hospital, Daniel was sitting at the small table while Annie did her homework. Read this sentence, she said, pushing a book toward him. My teacher says reading out loud helps you get stronger. He looked at the sentence and read slowly. His voice still not as strong as before. Sometimes the people who help you the most are the ones you didn't expect to meet. Annie grinned. That's about you. He raised an eyebrow. I think that's about you. Sarah watched them from the kitchen, her expression thoughtful and quiet. Later that night, after Annie went to bed, Daniel and Sarah sat at the table again, the same way they had so many nights now. You're getting stronger, she said. I feel different, he admitted. Not just my heart, everything. She nodded like she understood. I spent most of my life building something, he said. Companies, deals, money. I thought if I built enough, I'd be safe. But I was just building walls and calling them success. Sarah didn't interrupt. When I was sitting on that bench, he continued, I had everything people think matters. And I had no one to call. No one to sit next to me. No one who cared if I went home that night. He looked around the small apartment. The leaning Christmas tree was still there even though it was now January. Annie refused to let them take it down yet. And now, he said quietly, I have this place. This loud, small, crowded place. And I've never felt more safe in my life. Sarah looked down at her hands for a moment, then back at him. This place isn't what made you safe, she said gently. People did. He held her gaze. Yeah, he said, you did. For a moment, neither of them looked away. Daniel, she said softly. You know Annie is getting attached to you. I know, he said. And I need to know something, she continued. When you get stronger, when you go back to your big house and your big life, are you going to disappear? The question hung in the air between them. It wasn't an accusation. It was fear. Quiet, honest fear. Daniel thought about the bench, about the hospital room, about the drawing with 3 stick figures, about the way Annie checked every morning to make sure he was still on the couch. He shook his head slowly. No, he said. I'm not disappearing. I spent my whole life building a life I didn't actually want. I don't think I want to go back to it the way it was. Sarah studied his face for a long moment, making sure he understood what he was saying. This life, she said quietly, comes with noise, and bills, and problems, and a little girl who will knock on the bathroom door if you stay in there too long. Daniel smiled. That sounds exactly like the kind of life I want. From down the hallway, Annie's sleepy voice called out, I heard my name. Are you guys talking about me again? Daniel and Sarah both laughed softly, and sitting there in that small kitchen, with a healing heart and a second chance he never expected to get, Daniel realized something simple and certain. The worst day of his life had started on a cold bench when he thought he had lost everything, but it turned out that was the day he found where he belonged. By the second week of recovery, Daniel could walk from the couch to the end of the hallway and back without needing to sit down. Annie timed him every day like it was an Olympic sport. 27 seconds, she announced one afternoon, looking at the kitchen timer very seriously. That's 3 seconds faster than yesterday. Your heart is getting better. I'm glad I have such a strict coach, Daniel said, lowering himself carefully back onto the couch. You need one, Annie replied, because you're not good at resting. You keep trying to stand up and do things. From the kitchen, Sarah called out, She's right. Sit down, Daniel. He raised his hands slightly in surrender and sat back. He wasn't used to being told what to do in such a calm, unquestionable way. In his world, people suggested things carefully. They didn't tell him to sit down. But here, in this small apartment, he was not the man who signed paychecks and made decisions for hundreds of employees. He was just a man who needed to heal. A few days later, Daniel insisted on walking Annie to school with Sarah. It was cold. The kind of cold that made the air feel sharp in your lungs. But Daniel said he needed the exercise. Annie walked between them, holding Daniel's hand on one side and her mother's on the other, swinging their arms as they walked. This is what families look like, she said matter-of-factly. Daniel and Sarah exchanged a quick glance over her head but said nothing. At the school gate, Annie turned to Daniel. You're going to rest today, right? She asked. Yes, ma'am, he said. And take your medicine? Yes, ma'am. And not do secret work on your phone? He smiled. You sound exactly like your mother. That's because Mama is very smart, Annie said, then hugged him quickly before running toward the school building. Daniel watched her go, his expression thoughtful. She really loves you, Sarah said quietly beside him. Daniel nodded slowly. I know, he said. That scares me a little. Sarah looked at him. Why? Because I don't ever want to be another person who walks out of her life, he said. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then don't, she said simply. They began walking back toward the apartment slowly, matching Daniel's pace. Daniel, Sarah said after a moment, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. All right, when you get fully better, she said. What happens then? You have a company, a house, a whole other life. This This is not your world. Daniel stopped walking for a moment. Cars passed. A dog barked somewhere down the street. A school bell rang behind them. I thought my world was the big house and the company, he said slowly. But when I got sick, none of that sat with me in the hospital. None of that held my hand. None of that told me I wasn't allowed to be sad alone. He looked at her. People are your world. I just didn't know that before. Sarah held his gaze, searching for any sign that he was saying this out of gratitude instead of truth. But what she saw in his face was something else. Something steady. That afternoon, Daniel received a call from his office. He hadn't been there in weeks, and the board was starting to get nervous. Sir, the board would like to schedule a meeting. His assistant, James, said carefully over the phone, they're concerned about your absence and the upcoming decisions on the Westbrook expansion. Daniel looked around the small living room. Annie's backpack was on the floor. A crayon lay near the couch. In the corner, the Christmas tree still leaned, even though it was almost the end of January now. I'll come in next week, Daniel said. But things are going to change. Change, sir? James asked. Yes, Daniel said. I built that company to have a life. I didn't build it to be my whole life. There was a long pause on the other end of the phone. Understood, sir, James said finally. That evening, Daniel told Sarah about the call while she cooked dinner. You're going back, she said quietly. I have responsibilities, he said. People depend on me. But that doesn't mean I want to go back to the way things were. She stirred the pot slowly. Big worlds and small worlds don't always fit together easily. Maybe they don't, he said, but I'm starting to think a man should choose the world where people would notice if he didn't come home. Sarah looked at him then, really looked at him. Annie would notice, she said softly. I would too, she added after a moment. Daniel felt that in his chest, in the place that still hurt but was healing. That night, Annie brought out another drawing. This one showed the three of them again, but this time they were standing in front of two houses, one very big, one very small. The three stick figures were standing in front of the small house. That's because the big house is too big, Annie explained. You'd get lost in there by yourself. But in our house, we can always find you. Daniel stared at the drawing for a long time. Annie, he said gently, what if one day I asked you and your mom to come see my big house? She thought about that very seriously. Okay, she said. But only if you promise you won't sit alone in it. He nodded. I promise. Later, after Annie went to bed, Daniel stood by the window looking out at the streetlights. Sarah walked up beside him. You know she's already decided you're part of her life, Sarah said quietly. I think, Daniel said, she became part of mine the moment she sat on that bench. He turned to Sarah then, his voice more serious than she had ever heard it. I meant what I said before the surgery, he said. About my will. About Annie. I don't say things like that lightly. Sarah looked at him, her eyes searching his face again, trying to understand how a man who had been a stranger a month ago could now be talking about forever. Daniel, she said softly, we walked into your life by accident. He shook his head slowly. No, he said. You walked into my life on purpose. You just didn't know it yet. And standing there in the quiet apartment, both of them understood that something had changed between them. Something bigger than gratitude, bigger than coincidence. Something that looked a lot like a family forming, one quiet day at a time. Daniel returned to his office on a gray Monday morning at the beginning of February, almost a month after the night he had sat on the bench. The building looked exactly the same as it always had: glass, steel, clean lines, quiet elevators, a lobby that smelled faintly of polished marble and expensive coffee. People straightened when they saw him walk in. A few looked surprised. A few looked relieved. Good morning, Mr. Carter, the receptionist said. Good morning, Helen, he replied, and she blinked slightly because he had never used her name before. In the elevator, Daniel looked at his reflection in the mirrored wall. He looked thinner, paler. There was still a careful way he moved, like his body was reminding him not to forget what had happened. But there was something else in his face, too. Something calmer. When he walked into the boardroom, the conversation stopped immediately. 6 people sat around the long table, men and women in expensive suits. People who were used to talking in numbers and strategies and risks. Daniel, Mark Benson, his business partner, said as he stood up. It's good to see you on your feet. It's good to be on my feet, Daniel said, taking his seat at the head of the table. They began with numbers. Profits. Expansion plans. A new development project. For the first 30 minutes, it felt like nothing had changed. Like he had just been on vacation and now he was back where he belonged. But then Mark said, "We delayed the Westbrook expansion because you weren't here to sign off. It's a big risk, but it could double our revenue in 5 years." Daniel looked down at the file in front of him, full of projections and charts and careful predictions about the future. 5 years. A few months ago, 5 years had been just a number on a chart. Now it felt like something else. Something fragile. Something not guaranteed. "Daniel?" Mark asked. "What do you think?" Daniel closed the file slowly. "I think," he said, "that for the first time in my life, I'm not interested in doubling revenue in 5 years." The room went very quiet. Mark frowned slightly. "I'm not sure I understand. I built this company to create freedom," Daniel said calmly. "Somewhere along the way, it started taking more freedom than it gave. I was working 80 hours a week, sleeping in my office, missing every holiday, every weekend, every chance to actually have a life." He looked around the table at people who had known him for years but suddenly looked like strangers. "A month ago, I had heart surgery," he continued, "and when I woke up, I realized something. If I had died, this company would have replaced me in a week. But there were 2 people sitting in the waiting room who would have had their lives changed forever." No one spoke. "I'm not selling the company," Daniel said, "and I'm not disappearing. But things are going to change. I'm stepping back from daily operations. Mark, you'll take over as CEO. I'll stay on as chairman. I'll still make the big decisions, but I'm not giving this company my whole life anymore." Mark stared at him. "Daniel, this company is your life." Daniel shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "It was. But not anymore." After the meeting, Daniel returned to his office. It was large, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The desk was perfectly clean. Everything was exactly where it had always been. But it didn't feel the same. He opened a drawer and took out Annie's drawing, the one with the hospital and the big red heart and the 3 stick figures waiting outside. He had brought it with him that morning without really thinking about why. There was a knock on the door. "Come in," he said. Mark stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "Are you sure about this?" Mark asked. "You built all of this from nothing. Most men would give anything to have what you have." Daniel looked out the window at the city for a long moment before answering. "I almost died," he said quietly. "And do you know what I thought about when I was lying on that operating table?" Mark didn't answer. "I didn't think about this office," Daniel said. "I didn't think about our biggest deal. I didn't think about the Westbrook expansion. I thought about a little girl who didn't want me to sit alone on a bench, and her mother who said she would be in the waiting room." Mark didn't speak for a long time. "Sounds like they matter," Mark said finally. "They do," Daniel said. "More than any of this." That evening, Daniel drove back across town, away from the glass buildings and the wide streets, back to the smaller roads and older buildings where Annie and Sarah lived. When he walked in, Annie ran up to him immediately. "You went back to your big office today," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a fact. Annie noticed everything. "I did," he said. She looked at him carefully. "Did you like it?" He thought for a moment. "Parts of it," he said. "But I like it here more." She seemed satisfied with that answer and took his hand to pull him toward the kitchen. "Mama made soup," she said. "Because you still have a heart that needs help." Sarah smiled at him from the stove. "How was your first day back?" Daniel sat down at the small table. "I changed my life today," he said simply. She looked at him, waiting. "I stepped back from the company," he said. "I'm not going to spend my life in that office anymore." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "That's a big decision." "Yeah," he said. "But almost dying is a big experience. It changes the math." Annie climbed into her chair. "What math?" Daniel smiled at her. "The kind that tells you what matters and what doesn't." Annie thought about that very seriously. "Do we matter?" she asked. Daniel looked at her, then at Sarah, then back at Annie. "More than anything," he said. And as they sat down to eat soup in the small kitchen, Daniel realized that the biggest decision of his life had not been a business deal. It had been deciding that he didn't want to sit alone anymore. By mid-February, Daniel was walking almost normally again. The doctor said his recovery was ahead of schedule, but Sarah said it was because he had 2 very strict nurses at home. Annie took this job very seriously. Every morning before school, she would stand in front of him with her hands on her hips and ask 3 questions. Did you take your medicine? Yes. Did you sleep? Yes. Are you going to do anything stupid today? Daniel would always smile at that one. No, he would say. I'm not going to do anything stupid today. Good, Annie would reply, because you are still under construction. One Saturday morning, about 6 weeks after the surgery, Daniel said, I want to show you something today. Both of you. If that's okay. Annie looked immediately excited. Is it a surprise? Yes, he said. Sarah looked more cautious. Daniel, it's not a big scary surprise, he said gently. I just want to show you where I live. Annie's eyes went wide. Your big house? My big house, he said. They drove across town, from the smaller streets with old apartment buildings and corner stores to the wide, clean roads lined with tall trees and large homes that sat far back from the street. When the car turned into Daniel's driveway, Annie leaned forward between the seats and whispered, Whoa. The house was large, white, with tall windows and a wide front porch. It looked like the kind of house Annie had only seen in movies. Daniel turned off the car but didn't get out right away. I need to tell you something before we go in, he said quietly. Annie and Sarah both looked at him. This house, he said, used to feel like a prize, like proof that I worked hard and won something. But after I got sick, it just felt empty, like a very nice place to be alone. Sarah didn't say anything, but she understood what he meant. They went inside. Annie walked slowly from room to room, her eyes wide, her shoes making soft sounds on the wooden floors. It's so big, she said. You could get lost in here. I was lost in here, Daniel said quietly. They walked into the kitchen, which was bigger than Sarah's entire apartment. Annie looked around, then said very seriously, It needs more noise. Daniel laughed softly. Yeah, he said. It does. They ended up in the living room, where sunlight poured in through tall windows. Annie climbed onto the large couch and bounced once, then stopped herself. Sorry, she said quickly. I forgot this is a fancy couch. Daniel sat down in a chair across from her. Annie, he said, I didn't bring you here to show you a fancy couch. Then why? She asked. He looked at Sarah for a moment, then back at Annie. His hands rested on his knees, and for the first time since they had met, he looked nervous. Because, he said slowly, I don't want to live here alone anymore. The room went very quiet. I was sitting on a bench a few weeks ago, he continued. I thought my life was ending, and then a little girl sat down next to me and told me I didn't have to sit alone. Annie watched him without moving, and then I met her mother, he said, his eyes moving to Sarah for a moment, and the two of them did something no one had ever done for me before. They stayed. They sat in waiting rooms. They made sure I took my medicine. They made sure I didn't sit alone when I was sad. Sarah's eyes filled slightly, but she said nothing. Daniel took a slow breath. I grew up in a house where people didn't stay, he said. My father worked all the time. My mother died when I was young. I learned very early how to be alone and call it independence. I told myself I didn't need anyone. He looked at Annie again. But I was wrong. Annie slid off the couch and walked over to stand in front of him. I don't want to just visit you, Daniel said softly. I don't want to just be the man who comes by sometimes and fixes the sink and helps with homework. I want to be part of your life. Both of your lives. For real. Not just for now. Sarah's hand moved slowly to her mouth. Daniel's voice was steady, but his eyes were not. Sarah, he said, I know this is a lot. And I know I walked into your life by accident. But I don't think meeting Annie was an accident. And I don't think what we have now is an accident either. He stood up slowly, still careful with his healing body. I don't want Annie to ever wonder if I'm going to disappear, he said. I don't want you to ever sit at that kitchen table alone again thinking you have to carry everything by yourself. He looked at both of them, his voice quieter now. I want to be a family, he said, if you'll let me. The room was completely silent. Annie looked at her mother, then back at Daniel. Do you mean, she asked slowly, like a real family? Not just visiting? Daniel nodded. Yeah, he said. A real family. Annie walked forward and hugged him carefully, mindful of his chest. I already thought we were, she said into his coat. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment and wrapped his arms around her. Sarah stood there, looking at both of them, and for a long time she didn't speak. She was a woman who had learned not to trust big promises easily. Life had taught her that people sometimes meant what they said in the moment, but the moment didn't always last. Daniel, she said finally, her voice quiet but strong. Being a family isn't just a feeling. It's a decision you make every day. On the good days and the bad days, when it's easy and when it's very hard. He nodded. I know, he said, and I'm ready to make that decision. Every day. She studied his face for a long time, looking for doubt, for hesitation, for anything that looked like he might change his mind when life became inconvenient. She didn't see any. Finally, she walked over and stood in front of him and Annie. Well, she said softly, families sit together. That seems to be how this whole thing started. Daniel smiled, his eyes bright. Yes, he said, it did. And standing there in the big, quiet house that no longer felt quite so empty, the three of them stood close together. Not because they had planned it, not because they had expected it, but because sometimes a family begins with nothing more than a small voice saying, you don't have to sit alone. Spring came slowly that year. The snow melted first, then the trees began to show small green leaves, and the air no longer hurt when you breathed in too deeply. By March, Daniel could walk several blocks without getting tired, and by April, his doctor said the words Daniel had been waiting to hear. You're healing very well, Dr. Reynolds said, looking over the latest test results. Your heart is strong. But remember something, Daniel. Surgery fixes the muscle. It doesn't fix the life that made the muscle weak in the first place. That part is up to you. Daniel nodded. I understand, he said. And this time, he really did. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. Daniel didn't move Sarah and Annie into the big house right away. Instead, he did something that surprised even himself. He sold the big house. When he told Sarah, she stared at him like she wasn't sure she had heard correctly. You sold it? It was too big, he said simply. And it had too many empty rooms. I don't need empty rooms anymore. What did you buy? She asked. Daniel smiled a little. You'll see. The new house was not a mansion. It was a 2-story house on a quiet street with a small front yard and a big tree in the front. It had a wide porch with enough space for 3 chairs. Inside, there was a living room where you could see the kitchen, and a kitchen where you could see the dining table, and a dining table where no one would ever have to sit alone unless they wanted to. Annie ran through the house the first time they saw it, opening doors and looking in closets. This house is the right size, she announced. You can't get lost, but you can still play hide and seek. Daniel looked at Sarah. That was exactly the design requirement, he said. They moved in at the beginning of summer. The leaning Christmas tree was gone, but Annie insisted on keeping the crooked star from the top of it. She said every house needed a crooked star so people would remember that perfect things were not the things that made you happy. Daniel went back to work, but not the way he used to. He went to the office 3 days a week. The rest of the time, he worked from home at a desk in the corner of the living room while Annie did her homework at the table, and Sarah moved around the kitchen. Some evenings, Daniel cooked. He wasn't very good at it, but Annie said his pancakes were improving, which she considered a very important measure of success. One evening in December, almost exactly a year after the night on the bench, Daniel said, I want to go somewhere tonight. Where? Annie asked. The park, he said. The bench park? She asked. The bench park, he said. It was cold again, and Christmas lights were wrapped around the trees just like the year before. People walked past with shopping bags and hot drinks, and somewhere a group of kids were singing Christmas songs again. They walked slowly to the bench. The same bench. Daniel stood looking at it for a long moment before sitting down. This time, he didn't sit hunched over with papers in his hands. He sat back and looked up at the lights. Annie climbed onto the bench and sat on one side of him. Sarah sat on the other. Do you remember this bench? Annie asked. I remember everything about this bench, Daniel said. That's where I found you, she said. Daniel shook his head gently. No, he said. That's where you saved me. Annie leaned her head against his arm the same way she had the first night. You looked very sad, she said. I was, he said. I thought I had lost everything. And now? She asked. Daniel looked at the lights, then at Sarah, then at Annie. Now I know I hadn't lost everything, he said. I just hadn't found you yet. They sat there for a while, the three of them on the bench, not saying much. People walked past them the same way they had a year ago, not knowing that this bench was the place where a man's life had changed. After a while, Annie pointed to a small plaque on the back of the bench. It hadn't been there the year before. She read it slowly, sounding out the words the way she had practiced. You don't have to sit alone. She looked at Daniel with wide eyes. You put that there? He nodded. Yeah, he said, because there are a lot of people in this world who think they have to sit alone when things get hard. I wanted them to know they don't. Annie slipped her hand into his. Sarah slipped her hand into his other hand. See? Annie said softly. You're not sitting alone. Daniel looked at their hands, then up at the lights, then out at the world moving around them. A year ago, he had been a man with a failing heart, a broken relationship, and a life that looked perfect from the outside and empty from the inside. Now he was a man with a scar on his chest, a smaller house, fewer meetings, more noise, more laughter, more pancakes, more drawings taped to the refrigerator, and two people who would notice immediately if he didn't come home. He squeezed their hands gently. I used to think success was about how much you could build, he said quietly. Now I think it's about how many people sit next to you when you can't stand anymore. The Christmas lights glowed above them, soft and warm in the cold night air, and on a bench in a small park. A man who had once had everything and nothing at the same time sat between the two people who had given him the only thing that really mattered. He was no longer a man sitting alone. He was a father, a husband, and a man who had been given a second heart, not by the surgeon in the hospital, but by a little girl who had once looked at a stranger on a bench and said, "You don't have to sit alone." This story carries a simple but powerful lesson. No one is truly saved by money, success, or status. People are saved by people. Daniel had everything the world considers valuable, yet he was completely alone on the night he thought his life was falling apart. What saved him was not a doctor, not his wealth, but a little girl who chose to sit beside a stranger so he wouldn't feel alone. Sometimes, the greatest act of kindness is not solving someone's problems, but simply sitting with them in their pain. The story reminds us that family is not always the one you are born into, but the one that stays, the one that waits in the hospital, the one that notices when you don't come home. In the end, a successful life is not measured by how much you own, but by who sits beside you when you cannot stand on your own. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.